Okay. I work for this research organization called WRI, and I work for their climate resilience practice team, which predominantly looks at resilience building, adaptation related research for governments for the most of it. And we do also have some other research going on for different multilateral, bilateral agencies. So my area of work is on looking at how to help governments, state governments, district level governments, and other agencies look at adaptation as a mainstream agenda and look at how governments can actually start framing policies, sort of financing them. We also provide technical support for implementing some of these policies. So what I'm going to talk about today is some snapshots of, provide some snapshots on a project that we're doing. It's a multi-year project where we're working with specific MSME clusters. And to name it, we're looking at the textile cluster in Gujarat and the automobile cluster in Tamil Nadu. And we're looking at how vulnerable these clusters are to climate. And when we say that, we are looking at specific climate hazards. So in Chennai, for example, we're looking at cyclones, floods, and droughts. And in Gujarat, similarly, we have hazards that are relevant to the local region. And what we're trying to do is, first of all, understand how they're vulnerable, and then also look at what are their needs in terms of building resilience, what kind of financing options they have, what kind of skill sets they have, what sort of technological innovations are actually currently being used, what kind of upgrades are actually required. So these are the kind of aspects we're studying, and we're actually in the initial stage of that research. So we're actually currently analyzing what sort of vulnerabilities, scenarios we are looking at. And for that, we have actually gone about looking at specific clusters even within Chennai. For example, we've looked at Gindi, we've looked at Tirumudi Vakam, we've looked at Ambattur, parts of Tambaram. These are areas where there are a lot of MSMEs from the automobile cluster. So what we do is we're looking at multiple levels of vulnerability. We're looking at city level vulnerability, we're looking at more high resolution local level hazard mapping, and we're also looking at socioeconomic disparities, enterprise level vulnerabilities. So that's essentially what we're looking at, and as part of that, we are doing a very detailed vulnerability assessment. Then we're actually going around trying to document that in a systematic manner, looking at what kind of skills and skills are actually required for these enterprises to tide past these routine climate hazards, and how can we actually support them in that skill building in general. So I think a lot might have been said since the morning in terms of importance of MSMEs and all, so I won't go into that. But one thing that we actually saw was we looked at different strata of MSMEs. So we looked at small enterprises, medium, micro enterprises, and we sort of realized some initial insights that we got was that when we look at medium enterprises, they do have some sort of working capital which they can use for facing floods or cyclones for a short term, and that's sort of liquid capital which they rotate in different aspects and manage the contingency. But when we talk about small or micro enterprises, the kind of liquid capital which they have for facing these sudden fast onset disasters is a little lesser. And so it becomes a little difficult for them in trying to manage the entire situation, and there are several issues which they face. So for example, we came to understand that there's a lot of delays in terms of supply, be it in terms of raw materials from even within the city. For example, what happened in 2023 last year, almost the entire city was flooded. So in terms of getting raw materials or even finished products from different parts of the city was very difficult. So they, on an average, they faced like at least a couple of weeks of delay in terms of getting their products from an outsourced supplier or a processor, and actually give it to their end user or the retail outlet. So that's one delay that we saw. We also were able to note that there are significant health hazards. There are significant disease outbreaks that the labor faces, and this is also kind of different between different categories of labor. For example, there are certain contract laborers in MSMEs, and there are other more close to permanent labor force in MSMEs. So, and permanent labor is basically people from within Tamil Nadu or within Chennai who've been working for a long period in the MSMEs, and contractual labor are people who are migrant workers who are coming from other states and work in MSMEs here, right? And there are differences in terms of policies, insurance policies, health benefits, leave policies between both these categories of labor force. So what we tried to do there was also understand how climate hazards, so to say floods, droughts, or cyclones here actually impact even the labor force, and specifically different categories of labor who are employed in MSMEs. And apart from that, we also tried to understand what kind of physical damage enterprises face. So we looked at when a cyclone strikes or a flood affects the city, then what kind of insurance they have to actually cover the cost they will incur for the damages that they have actually faced. So we also came to understand that a lot of them, smaller enterprises, don't have any insurance, or they have, if it's a rented land or an office, then there's a different kind of insurance that's applicable there. And if it's an own building or a land, then there's a different insurance that they actually use there. And it covers only some of these structural damages which the enterprise might face because of them. But otherwise, there's a lot of loss which they face there, which is often something that they really struggle to kind of sort of cope with. And we try to understand if there's some sort of contingency fund that is available with MSMEs to kind of face these things, because floods and cyclones are becoming so regular now that it makes sense to look at some sort of dedicated fund. But we also came to understand there is no dedicated fund even for the slightly medium enterprises, which are bigger in terms of turnover, investment, and all of that. So the second thing we tried to do here was also look at what kind of support or policy response the states have and the center has when it comes to looking at resilience building adaptation for MSMEs. So as a lot of you might be aware, adaptation is something that has kind of come up very prominently in policy, state and center, in the last like 10 to 15 years, maybe max. But and that too, it's not an explicit agenda that's there. It's mostly interspersed with the traditional, conventional development agenda that's there, right? So we try to look at schemes, both centrally sponsored state schemes, which have some sort of direct or indirect focus on adaptation, resilience building, and with a specific emphasis on MSMEs. And we also came to understand that there are very few and far examples of dedicated funds which look at adaptation, and most of them are even redundant now. To give an example, there was a National Adaptation Fund on climate change, which doesn't look at MSME specifically, but more looking at rural development, agriculture at the state level. There were a few other funds which are floated, but they don't have a great focus on adaptation, resilience building on MSMEs. But the other thing that we can probably look at is there are several dedicated funds under the UNFCCC which do actually cater to requirements of MSMEs, both mitigation and adaptation. But the challenge is to kind of build the capacities and the awareness for MSMEs to access these funds to different middlemen. So these funds are not directly available to MSMEs, but they're actually usually tied to either a state government or the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, or there are other slightly more direct channels, but the process involved in actually accessing these funds is very cumbersome. So for small enterprises or generally MSMEs, it's very difficult to first of all even be aware of these, and then accessing them is a far cry. So I think when we generally don't try and talk about climate funds and specifically adaptation funds for MSMEs, because they are at the distance between the enterprises who actually need this money and the providers is quite big, and the modalities involved are very complicated. So we haven't really gone very deep into that, but there are instances where climate funds have actually funded both mitigation largely, but a bit of adaptation as well in some countries. So that's something we also try to look at as part of this research. So one thing coming back to the schemes that we are looking at both at the state level and central level, so we realize that there is funding, there are a lot of incentives being provided to enterprises, both in terms of skilling for new entrepreneurs. For mitigation, definitely there are incentives being provided for environment-friendly technologies, so on and so forth. But when we talk about adaptation or resilience building, there is no dedicated scheme which looks at this part of it. So what we are actually trying to do here is bring together different MSME associations. There are associations for each cluster, like the Ambattur Association or the Guindy Association. There are several of them, and there are obviously other what we call as OEMs, the bigger manufacturers, the bigger companies for whom the MSMEs work and supply products, smaller products for them. We've also tried to use that channel to see if we can form like a more collective opinion about what their requirements are in terms of resilience building as well as skill building for enhancing resilience, and how that can be actually presented to the state government and the central government. So essentially, this is what we are trying to do here, and this is still work in progress. So I wouldn't really go into the details of all the findings so far, but yeah, maybe I'll just stop there. Yeah, thanks.
Because even in this last flood, MSMEs faced, especially in Ambattur, they faced a lot of loss in equipment, and
Yeah.
there was not much support or even a form of a grant or a aid or a fund that could help
Yeah.
them out.
Yeah, actually, interestingly, some insights we got was a lot of MSMEs, but this is more for the medium enterprises who have enough capital to actually make some structural changes. After the 2015 flood, we came to understand that a lot of them have actually made significant structural changes in their enterprise. They've actually increased the stilt height, and they've completely elevated the entire enterprise. And they also, some of them actually have some liquid money which they kind of anticipate some sort of damage during the monsoon period, and they keep it there. And informal lending, borrowing is what actually happens, but I think there's no grant support specifically looking at MSMEs per se. And the other thing we also wanted to kind of highlight here was just forgetting what I wanted to say. Yeah, so I wanted to bring out one point was that in terms of tying it back to the circular economy, circularity concept that you're bringing out here, I think one thing that we've also sort of touched upon in our analysis is how circularity or circular economy, in many cases, there are some very interesting case studies. I'm sure a bunch of them are presented today on how that could actually feed into the reducing the financial burden of MSMEs for raw materials or even like reusable material. Because I think what happens is that we've also gathered is that getting supply of raw materials or even like logistical delays which are caused due to climate in general can be tided by some sort of circularity which some enterprises have actually looked at. But I think again this is sort of mostly stuck to the medium and the small enterprises. I think micro enterprises are the most vulnerable, so we didn't really find too much evidence on that. But I think there are a lot of examples in the Surat textile industry, largely in the agriculture and agro related enterprises. There are several examples of reusing water from the urban local bodies for enterprises. There are also examples of using used cloth material for heat generation through thermal mechanisms. Because instead of using going back to coal-powered plants, they've also looked at using already used and waste material for doing that. There are also associated health-related aspects to that, but we found some very interesting case studies around the Surat cluster for this.